So I'd just like to welcome everybody and thank you for Zooming in. I hope that the technology holds up with the number of people that we've got all calling in from home offices. What we might do is when we get actually to the presentation, I'll just ask everyone to, put on your mute, cut off your screen monitors, and then when we come back to the actual Q&A, let's all come back up with our monitors on so that poor Bill gets to actually see some faces in terms of just all of our names. And I just want to start off first by acknowledging and paying our respects to Aboriginal custodians on who have kind of ownership of all of the lands on which we're currently working from around the countryside. And in particular, I think just acknowledge and recognise the stress and pressures that a lot of the Aboriginal people that we work with are under at the moment. I see out in Western New South Wales, their total COVID cases in those small towns are up to over 40 positive COVID cases. And one of our own CAEPR colleagues in... sorry, I'll just ask people to turn your mics on mute. One of our own CAEPR academic colleagues out in Gaduga. I see that small town of 250 people have got 8 positive COVID cases as of today. So we just also share our concern and best wishes for everybody in terms of where they're working and living. And it gives me great pleasure in these stressful times to welcome Dr. Bill Fogarty. And while I get the chance to embarrass him publicly, say a few words about him. Bill has got enormous depths of professional expertise in Indigenous education, pedagogy, place-based learning, but as well as that professional disciplinary expertise, has just an extraordinary depth of field-based work with Indigenous communities, especially in the north, but around Australia, and is currently also publishing 2 books on these issues, one with Centre for Sami Studies on internationally on Indigenous education and citizenship, and another one on the discourses of education. So I'd just like to make you welcome and also acknowledge that Bill has just very recently taken over as the interim director of CAEPR, so we're very pleased to have him in that.
Another week yet, Di? Another week, yeah.
Another week, but we basically still go to him as needing to sign off 500 things. So welcome, Bill, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Di, and thanks everyone for coming today. There's quite a lot of people here, obviously lockdown. People are a bit looking for something to do maybe, but hopefully this is something interesting for you today. I too would like to just start with a bit of acknowledgement of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri unceded lands on which I'm sitting today, and acknowledge all the lands across. I can see lots of people from lots of different places. So, and just a little acknowledgement that I like to do. Nara nama gamarang wungi, nara marangi, nara malo, waprali, nara muma, pagaritpa, nara marangi, wakamabe, gamari, gachi, gali japlan, enakere, gere. I'm just acknowledging a couple of really important people and places that have had an influence on me. I'm just going to share my screen here. Everyone see that okay?
Yes, Bill. Yep.
Okay, great. Okay, so today's seminar is about place-based pedagogy and learning on country. It's really part of a three-part series that we're running at CAEPR around education on and off country. I'll be doing this week's seminar, and then in a couple of weeks, the next one I think is Marnie O'Brien, who'll be talking about boarding schools on and off country. And then we'll have Claire Rafferty, who'll be talking about some of the kind of PhD work that she's just about finished. She's in the final throes, so make sure you don't miss those ones. I'm sure they'll be far more interesting than the one I'm going to give you today, but hopefully you'll get a bit out of this today. So look, today's seminar, I wanted to do a few things. I'm going to make you sit through a little bit of theory because, I don't know, I felt like it's time I did a little bit of that. Not too much, but a little bit about theories of place and how they've informed some of the kind of traditions, how they've informed and not informed some of the traditions of place-based education. And then I want to talk a little bit about some Indigenous concepts of place-based education, and then spend probably the bulk of the seminar talking a little bit about one place-based education program that I've been involved with for quite a while now, called Learning on Country. There are about 215,000 Indigenous school students in Australia, and they're characterised by geographic, socio-economic and cultural diversity. Indigenous education in Australia is highly contested, highly politicised, and has long been marked by real contestation in the policy arena, as well as in the media and in public discourses. Unsurprisingly, approaches to Indigenous education at the chalk face have oscillated really between these two positions of, on the one hand, an attempt to attain statistical equality between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, and then on the other hand, advocating for self-determined educational development. So these two positions have kind of really oscillated at the chalk face. And yet my argument is that they don't need to be mutually exclusive. Contemporary policy approaches are set against an unresolved legacy of institutionalised racism, systemic underfunding, and assimilationist ideals that have dominated education for Indigenous students in Australia. I'd argue that this is still evidenced in the paucity of opportunities Indigenous students have to attend high schools in their own communities, to study in their own languages, and in the well-documented disengagement and non-attendance in the educational process by many Indigenous students. And I think you'd all be aware of some of the appalling outcomes against standard measures, but I'm not going to rehearse those today. So emerging evidence in Australia and an increasingly strong research base overseas is demonstrating that models of place-based education for Indigenous students can meet that want for self-determined education while also contributing to better education outcomes against mainstream measures. However, there's also evidence that untheorised and uncritical applications of place-based education for Indigenous students can be detrimental. So I want to talk a little bit about some of that today, but also first I want to start off with some of the concepts of place. So continued contest over rights to land in Australia and elsewhere around the globe has ensured that meanings of place are important in redressing the dispossession and marginalisation of Indigenous people. Issues of representation, authority and customary connection have become paramount as Indigenous stakeholders negotiate new meanings of place and identity. This is often in response to the impacts of modernity and development. Concepts of place for Indigenous people globally have become internationalised in response to the undoing of place through colonisation. So, for example, Mucklebach in their analysis of the United Nations Working Group and the Permanent Forum at the UN, which went on to write UNDRIP, argues that the delegates that came together there created a new Indigenous place within the forum. In Australia, First Nations people have co-opted and adopted the word country to describe their relationship to land and place, and in the process positioned the term as central to their identity. Inherent in this term is the notion that the people and the land form an indivisible one, a whole that inscribes a partnership transcending the material and intimately connected to the cosmological. Country, like place, therefore, can hold a meaning far greater than geographical or physiological descriptor. It is, in a difficult and paradoxical sense, both a localised and a universal essence, an immediately concrete and inordinately abstract concept. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, the Western gaze of mainstream education has had great trouble in seeing and grasping the deeper meanings of the term country. Such understandings of country are neither homogeneous nor easily reified. They are rather an amalgam of the past and the present, and the individual and the collective. Country and place come together in what De La Canda and Starn have termed a dense dialogical formation of identity. I kind of like that. Similarly, an attachment to or understanding of country is much shaped by the discourses and histories of the struggles for rights and place in land. This struggle is also a deliberative part of constructing an identity differentiated from the settler state. Out of this complexity grows a multiplicity of Aboriginal cultural formations, which are very much underpinned by a sense of place. Using this importance of place can therefore contribute to an Indigenous-centric, place-based pedagogy in local schooling. As a platform for learning, Indigenous and intercultural knowledges of place enable local communities to engage in the pedagogic process as experts. This shifts control to people delivering and receiving learning in a way that can decolonise or access resurgent ideals in curricula and make it relevant and culturally responsive for Indigenous students. So I just want to come back to kind of some of the traditions of place and in the academy. The study of place, place-based education really begins in understanding some of the theoretical concepts of place. The study of place is a cornerstone of academic investigation in both the physical and the social sciences. This has spawned a large body of work critiquing, deconstructing and reconstructing our understandings of what place means. Research in the last 2 decades has focused on the development of an anti-essentialist notion of place, where place is disturbed by new spatial concepts of in and out migration, globalising capital formulation, and the rise of virtual cultures. Such efforts have done much to expose the artificial boundaries between the local and the global. Castry, for example, argues that a bounded geographic notion of place is, and I quote, a denial of a fundamental ontological fact of our time, namely that the global is in the local. There's a similar trajectory on discourses of place to be found in political geography, archaeology, and environmental ecology. Conversely, there's also a defensive place in the literature, arguing that critical theory has developed a tendency to focus upon the global to the detriment of nuances provided by the study of place. Escobar reminds us that this erasure of place has profound consequences for our understandings of culture. For understandings of culture, knowledge, nature, and economy. He argues that people will continue to construct boundaries around their places, no matter how permeable and changeable these boundaries may be. In critical education theory, the role of place is positioned as central in learning and knowledge processes. This umbilical between learning and place exists at one level simply because most learning happens in place, be it virtual or real. And it is what we learn in place that makes us both similar and different. The premise here is that learning is a cultural process and that concepts of learning are historically and locally situated in place. The knowledge transmitted to and experienced by a student in and about place from his or her earliest moments can shape the person they become in adulthood. These powerful learnings in situ form the basis for pedagogies of place and should feature prominently in the design of Indigenous education. Seminal work by Indigenous scholars such as Nakata, Batiste, Smith, and others challenge us to decolonise the way knowledge is reproduced and produced. We need to do this by challenging Western understandings of place and repositioning education approaches to allow for space for First Nations perspectives to come into our understandings and our ways of bringing place and into education. Let's go to place-based education now. The importance of place in the cultural production of the educated person, as Levinson and Holland might put it, has a long academic and applied tradition. However, until relatively recently, the development of a pedagogy of place has traversed a path parallel to the anthropological and critical discourse studies of place I discussed just before. A pedagogy of place in the academy might arguably have been seen to have its beginnings in John Dewey's progressive education theories. Essentially, Dewey was a proponent of a positivist education approach and a learner-centred method through scientific inquiry. Since then, throughout its development, place-based education has had its roots in environmental and science-based education. Unsurprisingly, the ecology or physiology of the landscape has been at the fore of such approaches. This type of education has many generic terms, but has grown to be concerned with people and their immediate surrounds. To widen this frame, a guy called Gruenwald in 2003 wrote a seminal paper where he explicitly linked a pedagogy of place with critical theories of education and discourse. Gruenwald's later work and the drawing together of critical theories of communication, education and development have reinvigorated the importance of local pedagogy, but with the neo-Marxist or Fogartian representations of class, power, gender or ethnicity at its centre. Much of this draws heavily on Freirean traditions, so Paulo Freire, and argues that communities can reform education by inserting their own educational aspirations into the organisation, management and curriculum of schools. In this way, community self-determined goals can become aligned with those of educational delivery, perhaps. Internationally, place-based approaches are now considered vital in environmental and science programs for Indigenous students, particularly in Canada and the United States, and to a lesser extent in New Zealand and Norway, where I've spent some time having a look at place-based programs for Indigenous students. While efforts at linking learning programs with the local environment have been a consistent feature of Indigenous education in Australia, these efforts have generally been disparate. Theoretical leaders in Australia, such as McInerney and Green, have focused research effort to develop pedagogic frameworks for policy or programs which use local concepts of place as a platform for learning. And these are having demonstrable success when such approaches appear on the ground. More recently, however, a cadre of leading international researchers, including people like Johnson, Gruenwald and Batiste, have been working on the design of new theoretical frameworks for Indigenous place-based education. So I just sort of wanted to give you that little bit of a kind of a theoretical frame, I suppose, for where the program of learning on country that I'm going to talk about actually sits in terms of the academic work and the research behind it. But it's also very much a ground-up program. So I'll turn to a little bit of that, if I haven't put you to sleep with that theoretical introduction, and talk a little bit about the fact that these new theoretical partnerships with First Nations understandings of place are actually challenging mainstream notions of education, and they are demonstrating success. So I'm going to talk a little bit about learning on country. Of course, in many regards, learning on country goes back to the original First Nations classroom, where all learning happened on country, be it in ceremony, through experiential learning, or whatever. But in terms of its engagement with formal Western education, it's had really multiple beginnings that have really been disparate, I suppose. I think that really where an approach to learning that was more formalised was made possible was by a coalescence of policy and programs and opportunities that came together probably towards the end of the late 90s through into the first half of the noughties, if you like. And Learning on Country was very much a bottom-up, locally shaped program, and it brings together Indigenous ranger groups, local schools, researchers and communities. But it also, very importantly, has embedded an explicit literacy and numeracy and language outcomes as part of its raison d'etre. But really, it was the Caring for Country movement in Arnhem Land that allowed this particular Learning on Country program to begin. So I'll talk a little bit about the beginnings of Learning on Country. Learning on Country was very much a case of a group of teachers and rangers and concerned community members getting together, and it was driven by a want for a different form of education that both engaged far more heavily in Indigenous knowledge at its starting point, but that also had access and created opportunity for community to be seen not just as learners but as leaders. At the same time, it was kind of a reaction to some of the policy movements at a national and in the Northern Territory. Some of the policy movements against culture, if you like, culturally based programs and self-determined education programs, and in particular the bilingual programs, which were based in first language and had a lot of support in communities. And I won't go into the history of bilingual education here, but suffice to say there was quite a battle around the provision of bilingual education at the time that Learning on Country was just starting to sort of emerge as a new kind of a new way forward. And I think in many regards, Learning on Country's success is sort of reinvigorating some of the ideals and pedagogic understandings that drove the bilingual program. So Learning on Country aims to employ existing community capacity and to extend and formalise activities that incorporate Indigenous, Australian and Western knowledge systems. So the aim is for students literally to learn on country, but also in the classroom and under a combination of different teaching angles and therefore different knowledge holders, such as senior traditional owners, local community members, community rangers, vocational education training, voc ed type programs, scientists, and of course teachers who are very much involved in delivering the program. The idea of Learning on Country is that it very much moves from the unknown to the known and then back to the unknown again. So the idea is you're facing the beginnings of learning in education that students actually have some knowledge about and feel comfortable with. And it also aims to have open-ended employment pathways. I had a little video to show you here, but between Di and I, with our amazing technological abilities, we weren't able to get the sound working. I had that problem the other day, so I won't play it, but I will flick it out to the seminar mailing list so you guys can have a look. It's a little video that Yudikala made, and it's a pity I can't show it today because it just gives you a little bit of a feel for what it actually looks like on the ground. But I'll make sure I send that out after the seminar. Okay, so my own involvement in Learning on Country through my time as a homelands teacher. I was working out in lots of different homelands in the Maningrida region. At that time, I felt that a lot of the educational delivery that I was being tasked with from the Northern Territory Education Department seemed completely, not only useless, it also I felt that some of the learnings that I was being told to deliver to the people and students in front of me was really another plank in a long form of a long process of colonisation. And I was particularly uncomfortable with the types of learnings that I was being told to deliver. So myself and some of my other colleagues who felt the same, we looked around and we could see that at the same time the Caring for Country movement was really gaining a lot of success. So this is in around about the late 99, early 2000. And we could see that Caring for Country as a movement really was really engaging community, but more immediately for us, it was really engaging the students and the young people that we were teaching, and we could see that they were really responding to some of the kind of the work that and the messaging that was coming out of Caring for Country. So in lots of places as Caring for Country developed, a lot of small disparate junior ranger programs, sometimes they were called land and learning programs, had different various names, sort of sprung up as a natural kind of really organic partnership between education and community. But they were very disparate and they didn't seem to have any real pedagogic foundation to them. They often worked on quite ad hoc arrangements where a ranger might come down to the school and a teacher might engage with ranger programs or with community leaders, but it didn't really have a pedagogic foundation, and also it lacked resources and also any sort of real way to kind of inculcate this into the broader mainstream schooling that was going on at the time. I got quite interested in this and I wrote a thesis called Learning Through Country and finished that in 2010. As part of that, spent quite a lot of time on fieldwork, going through lots of different communities, mostly in eastern and western Arnhem Land, but also down in the desert as well, down in Central Australia, looking at what programs were actually around, but also talking to people about this idea that eventually we kind of collectively morphed into a program called Learning on Country. As with most things in First Nations development in Australia, the government came belatedly and quite unwillingly to support the idea of learning on country. Really what we did was start a couple of programs up. Two programs started at Uralka and one at Maningrida first, and we basically just did it. We managed to have some support through what was then called the Indigenous Ranger Cadet program, running out of what was then OIPC, I think, and got a very small amount of money. I think it was like $50,000, which we spread across those three sites to start actually working up a proper program called Learning Through Country. The Dimaroo Ranges, Uralka Ranges and Jelk Ranges were instrumental in helping us get that stuff off the ground. So this was going on while I was doing my PhD research, and we managed to form a kind of a steering committee for Learning on Country, where we got some senior elders, senior TOs from different communities, senior rangers, senior educators, and some scientists as well, together to actually start looking at developing a program. Eventually, we managed to get some funding and start running the program in 4 pilot sites. This started off in 2013 as an official program. 2011 as an official program. And we started at Maningrida, Gulawinku, Uralka, and out in the Uralka homelands. And I'm very pleased to say that all 4 of those sites are still running very strong Learning on Country programs. The program was evaluated by a joint partnership between the National Centre for Indigenous Studies and CAEPR, and that evaluation was completed of those pilot sites in 2015. The first evaluation found that there was quite a significant impact on attendance and engagement of Indigenous students when they were engaged in the Learning on Country program. It also found that there was a lot of more engagement of community in this particular type of program, as well as producing vocational and secondary outcomes for students. So on the back of that, eventually the government provided some more funding for learning on country, and I'll just move my screen out of the way so you can see that better. As you can see, spread a bit like COVID actually pretty quickly to quite a few different sites around, mostly around that northern Arnhem Land region, but down to Barunga and Beswick as well. There's currently 15 sites where Learning on Country is running. The Northern Land Council is now auspicing the Learning on Country program. There was quite a bit of politics around that. As I said, we'd set up a steering committee which was very much locally run and was being housed, and they wanted to incorporate Learning on Country as an incorporated body to house the funding and to run the program. It was going to run auspiced by Dimaroo in Utica, in Nhulunbuy, but the minister, in his wisdom at the time, Nigel Scullion, decided with a stroke of a pen that he would take all the funding and give it to the Northern Land Council, which wasn't very well received by some of the sites that had put years of work in developing this program. As it stands at the moment, the Northern Land Council is the auspicing body, but it runs under a governance model where a steering committee that's made up of senior representatives from each of the Learning on Country sites that you can see on the map there. They make the decisions, and the Northern Land Council is, at least in name, an auspicing body that provides some administrative support and some program management. I won't say too much more about that at this point because I'm leading an evaluation with a colleague, Kate Bellchambers, who might be here today, on those 15 sites. That evaluation's due to come down in December 2021, was due at 2020. We've pushed it out because of COVID. Who knows if we'll be able to get through everything we need to get through with everything that's going on, but hoping to have that evaluation completed by the end of this year. It's probably worth saying at this point that Learning on Country funding comes solely from the Commonwealth. The Northern Territory Government provides in-kind support, which the major in-kind support that it provides is through housing for Learning on Country coordinators. But I think they're getting a pretty good deal for the money that they're putting in. The last trope of funding was $8 million and runs out in 2022. So you can see that although it's had major successes, there's still a fragility to this program that really is about its kind of, I suppose, weddedness to government funding and to the vagaries of federal policy shifts. I just want to take you through, just to give you a little bit of idea of some of the types of things that happen on Learning on Country. You can see here, got some students that are doing some mapping and writing and dancing of songlines. So they're actually doing the dancing songlines with TOs and community members. They're then moving into using English literacy and numeracy and mapping skills to map songlines, and then bringing some of that writing back into the classroom. Here's a more practical on the kind of vocational education side. We've got some students here welding together a feral pig trap. So you've got a ranger there teaching one of the students. A lot of the senior students involved in Learning on Country are also doing certificates in land and sea management. So they form part of their Year 12 packages and part of Learning on Country. Here we have one of the Dimaroo Rangers teaching a Learning on Country student how to use one of the eye tracker devices that people are using out on country to record things like cultural sites, transects, feral animal populations, maybe weeds, the usual kind of Indigenous ranger work that I'm sure a lot of people here today are quite familiar with. This is the Uralka Ranges. This is out at one of the homelands out from Yitakala. And this particular learning on country camp, the students were out working with rangers to document dolphin populations that had potted up in a particular area at a particular time of year. And mob and owners for that country, that sea country, knew when this was going to happen. They were able to talk to rangers about that. The rangers were involved in a survey, an NRM survey, and the learning on country students were able to be a part of that. It's a pretty cool sort of work. Here we have, and I really like this photo, I've used it for a long time because it's some senior students from Maningrida learning about feral animal damage. So flying over some of their country to get literally a kind of bird's eye view of the damage that feral animals can cause. And this is just a little photo of some of the damage to floodplains that buffaloes cause in that region. So you can see pretty exciting sort of learning for students and highly engaging. This is a camp at Uralka where, just to give you an idea of sort of who's involved, had around 22 students at this particular camp, rangers, TOs and teachers all coming together. This particular one was a 4-day camp, I think, from memory. And obviously there's work that rangers do. Students are intimately involved in it. Teachers are involved in the planning. And then they take the learning from that camp and workshop back into the classroom, which forms part of their curriculum for the next term or semester, depending on which school or place you're talking about. The other side of learning on country is that it's always had, in part driven by government, I think, but in part driven by local wants for pathways to employment. This is a program from quite a few years ago, but I thought it was a really good example of kind of learning on country in action. This was a spider survey that students did. They decided that as part of their learning on country, they wanted to look at spiders. I don't know why you would choose that. I wish they didn't, but because it ended up with me driving around with spiders in my truck, but I'll tell you that story another time. But they managed to find 33 different species of spiders that hitherto were unknown to Western science. They were very well known by local mob, but not known to Western science. And a scientist from Melbourne became very interested particularly in the venom properties of these spiders, and actually flew a heap of the learning on country kids down to Melbourne to help do some studies on venom properties and extraction and the use for pharmaceutical production, which was really kind of interesting. But what came out of this actually was that a couple of these kids here that you see working on on documenting the spiders actually ended up becoming rangers and ended up working in partnership with some of the scientists from Melbourne University. Here we've got some learning on country students setting up game cameras or trail cams. These are sensor triggered cameras. They're setting up a transect to document marsupial life in a particular transect that they were looking at there. And again, you can see the kind of the translation of knowledge from the local, where you're really relying on local knowledges about animals and their populations, habitats, and through things like songlines, etc., to find densities, then being able to map those in a Western scientific sense using kind of transects and scientific methodologies. And of course, this translates back into the classroom where the students are learning about both of those kind of ways of doing. This is just a little shot of a kid on a learning on country camp learning how to make a fish wire, which is still a pretty standard tool in much of Arnhem Land. And these are just a couple of ex-Manangrita students who followed the LOC program right through from year 7 right through to year 12, graduated year 12. They're all employed. They're all now employed as rangers. And Jonah there at the back is actually one of the senior ranger coordinators at Manangrita now. This is just another little example of how learning on country translates back into the classroom. I like this one because it's kind of immediate in terms of mathematics. This was from some kids out at Dimaroo that were working on some of the beaches that are in the Dimaroo IPA, and they went out onto the beach. What did they find? How many? Documented that, cleaned it up. So they were doing that work with the rangers to help actually clean up some of this stuff, but documented that and then translated it back into a pretty simple mathematics exercise back in the classroom. This survey is a little bit old, but I still think it has resonance. This was a survey I did. I don't remember if I did this during my PhD or might have been during one of the evaluations I did. I can't remember now. But basically, this was in a remote community. I simply just listed every job that was available in the community, and then surveyed young people about from year 10 to year 12 about which job they would prefer to actually be engaged in. And you can see there that being a ranger kind of was streets ahead. So while not everyone can become a ranger, of course, you can see that in terms of engaging students learning, it has some real learning. And one of the biggest challenges in the bush is engaging students and giving learning purpose. So I think learning on country has real merit there. I'll finish off by kind of bringing us back to a little bit of the theoretical. This is just a model that we used it was actually one I developed during my thesis, but it's one that we used to kind of underpin some of the learning on country approaches. And you can see probably the most important thing of note to see here is around the locus of control. Who owns the program and who owns the learning and who drives it? The locus of control is shared between different domains of learning. And that's really at the heart of learning on country. Everyone's a learner, everyone's a student, and we take turns in being the teachers or the leaders as that goes forward. So last sort of words. I'm sort of about 12:45, which is when you wanted me to finish, I think, Di. The outcomes and trajectory for the program, I think, are good, and I'm hoping that we'll have a bit more to say probably in the first quarter of next year as we finish the latest evaluation. But probably the key impacts are around intergenerational transfer of knowledge, engaging community in schooling, attendance and retention of students, and significant outcomes into students transitioning through learning on country programs into work that they actually value and really want. So I might kind of leave it there for now. You've probably listened to me drone on for long enough. I'll stop that share, come back to the full screen. I'll hand back over to Di to have a talk.
Yeah, thanks very much, Bill. That was really informative, and it'd be great to have that copy of the YouTube as well to pass around.